Start with the riots that have shamed Britain. The police say that more than 100 anti-immigration demonstrations and 30 counter-protests are planned for tonight. So Keir Starmer has vowed rioters will face the full force of the law, as almost 4,000 officers are being deployed across the country, with a further 2,000 on standby. So is he handling the disorder well? A latest YouGov poll says that half of you think he's doing a very bad job. Well, let's speak to former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence, Major General Chip Chapman. Chip, listen, I've been observing all of this. In your view, first of all, I mean, there's lots of claims that these people who have... There are 3 men so far who have been sentenced, that the sentencing... I'm hearing people saying that the sentencing is too lax, and the reason why was because they were not sentenced under the grounds of terrorism. What would make what is happening in the riot terrorism? What is the delineation as to why it was not a harsher punishment?
Well, the first thing to say is that the punishments can be harsher around rioting. So you can get 10 years for rioting, you can get 7 years for disorderly conduct, which is racially motivated. You can get 5 years to criminal damage being around that. Just because it's done under a terrorist legislation doesn't mean that you'll actually get more years. And indeed, those who are do the most heinous crimes, which are terrorist-related, those who murder people, are actually done under criminal law, common law. That is, they are done for murder, not the fact that they committed a terrorist act. So those who normally are charged under terrorist legislation are those at the lower end of the scale who get generally 1 to 4 years about stirring up people to go and commit acts or propagandize around this. And I think you're going to see more of that coming out, because one of the groups around this complex Venn diagram are those sort of anonymous stirrers. They are the ones who cause a lot of people to surge in a physical sense to these protests, which then can become either far-right activism or racist gang violence. So under the Communications Act 2003, if you make menacing or false claims that lead to people going out to these events, you can be done for conspiracy to riot. Now, the real answer to your question is that terrorism must have either an ideological, political, racial, or religious motivation. If that racial or ideological motivation is there, then there is a chance of it being someone being done under terrorist legislation. But quite frankly, in terms of the left and right of arc of the law, it doesn't really make that much difference.
Because I kind of look at this and think that a lot of the earlier protests, I mean, we had a lot of pro-Palestine protests, and there was a lot of people letting off fireworks. And I'm just wondering, people have commented on two-tier policing as if, but the bottom line is violence is not acceptable. We know that on any level. It doesn't matter what you're fighting for. But does it feel that this could have been done actually with other protests, and why we're suddenly doing it now? If it had been done sooner, that we wouldn't be where we are now?
Well, to answer the first part of the question about the fireworks, the legislation was actually altered last year, the Public Order Act 2023, which prevents people from taking fireworks or letting them off. That would be a criminal offence. And, for example, going on to national monuments like the Cenotaph, that is also now an offence under the Public Order Act 2023. And those supplement the Public Order Act 1988 and 1936, the 36 one coming after the Cable Street riot. So there's no problem with the amount of legislation which is there to deal with this across left, right, pink, black, yellow, green, whatever. So the problem is not with the legislation. We've just got this sort of can of worms at the moment, which no one's dealt with in the last, really 20 years. Because if you take, for example, the reports, which I always look at because of my sort of background, after the race riots in 2002, there was a Cantle report which talked about a depth of polarisation around segregated communities living a series of parallel lives. That was in 2002. And the Casey Review into Integration and Opportunity in 2016 said a similar thing, that we've allowed diversity and difference to become separation and segregation. Those are the real top issues which the government have not really dealt with in the last 20 or 30 years, even though, for example, there is an integration committee in the House of Commons. We just haven't really got to grips with this, and that's why this powers the social mobilisation of people which then feeds into this physical mobilisation, and then it can be hijacked by people with a real agenda. But I think we'll see those people really being clamped down on pretty hard. And when you get pretty big jail sentences for these sorts of people, either those who are stirring it or those on the ground, that will probably give second thoughts to those people who might be involved in the future. The same has really happened after 2011, because it took people, the authorities looked for a number of months at the footage and phone footage and, the fact that we can do searches of phones and laptops. People were getting a knock on the door a year after the 2011 riots. So, without fear and favour means that, they'll be coming for you if you've been violent and you're, violently protest, particularly if you're violently protest with an ideology.
Well, Major Chip Chapman, I have to leave it there, but I will ask you one question very briefly. We've got about 10 seconds on this. Do you think the army should be brought in?
No, I don't. If only scale, simultaneity and endurance overwhelm the police, they're the three main criteria for bringing the army in, and if the government asks.
All right, thank you very much, Major General Chip Chapman. Thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now by News Political Editor, GBNews Political Editor, Christopher Hope. Christopher, what an interesting few weeks or so it's been. I mean, I went away very briefly. And I was in Portugal, it was on the news, I was hearing it from abroad. People
being the Southport attacks.
Yes. Then all of this has happened. Of course, the business with Elon Musk and Keir Starmer. And now here in the UK, we're now talking about a potential of 100 rioters and a potential 30 counter-protests. Where are we with this?
Well, we're day 8 or day 9 now. 16 or so towns and cities affected by troubles across England. And, of course, we saw some in Belfast this week. Hundreds of arrests, people being jailed, summary justice, people being imprisoned very quickly after being arrested for trouble around the country, doing what the Prime Minister says. It's a huge test for his leadership. I think we've got a government that's been in post for a month. Many of them are learning how to deal with the pressure of being in charge. Rather than talking about being in charge, they're in charge. So we should give them maybe a slight break on some of the areas. I know you're frowning at Nana. I'm being perhaps more fair than you might be. But I think maybe they're struggling to get across who they're speaking to. We're hopefully talking to ministers tonight about what's next. Mr. Speaker of the House of Commons right now reportedly has told MPs to work from home. We're seeing across the country, parts of the country, there are warnings going out about being in certain parts of the country. This is not any sense a honeymoon for this new Labour government. It's a complete nightmare for them. It would have been as bad for Rishi Sunak had the Tories delayed their election till November like we thought they would do. But this is right on the doorstep of this Labour government. The political battle right now is how to talk about what's happening and to understand why it's happening. There's been a lot of frustration amongst GBNews viewers and listeners about the idea it's all the far right, only the far right are concerned about immigration. That's an issue for lots of people, and we saw that's why the Tories lost so many votes at the last election. Immigration and concerns about that is across the board. It's not far right people, it's everybody, or a lot of people are concerned about it. Not everybody, a lot of people are concerned about it. The issue of two-tier policing is the issue at the moment. Now, Robert Jenrick, who's challenging to be the Tory party leader, and he's a favourite to get it, he says there needs to be a political... People in politics must call out protest by all sides, not just go after maybe white groups and ignore what Asian groups are getting up to. We heard from Sir Mark Rowley, he's saying that it's very hard, we're in the middle of the police, and what do we do next? And often, as I understand it, police officers can't really arrest. It takes two people out from policing a demonstration. So if you do arrest, it weakens the thin blue line, preserving a degree of peace in some of these protests. So explaining that better is a good idea. We're now seeing talk on social media of two-tier justice, where you're seeing, forget not policing, but two-tier justice. So you're seeing people being sent to prison for things which may not have done in the past. So there's now pressure on the courts. Is justice being meted out there being fair? What the government wants to do is get people prosecuted and shown to be prosecuted, and showing lives being ruined by being prosecuted, to try and stop people to step back from the brink and not get involved in the trouble. It is a huge test for any government, and particularly a new one.
Well, and I just bring back come back to your point about two-tier justice. And obviously Keir Starmer wasn't at the helm when, we had the beginnings of the pro-Palestinian protests. And I'm wondering, with the speed at which some of the people who were rioting, how quickly were they brought to justice? Because, look, I'm just looking at it and thinking, you can't blame Keir Starmer for that. That was a Conservative government who were in charge, who could have maybe sped up the legal process. But it does seem that this is done very, very quickly, whereas before it was allowed to get out of hand.
Well, going back to that, I mean, Trella Braverman was fired after she wrote an article which was then contested by Number 10, in which she talked about the police playing favourites in the way they policed pro-Palestinian groups and Jewish groups about that. But I guess this seems to be bigger in scale. That'd be the only way to explain it. You have got a Prime Minister who was DPP, the head of the prosecution service, back in 2011, when courts opened round the clock to process rioters. So he's been at the front line. I mean, critics would say he's seeing this as just a kind of law and order issue, when, of course, we would argue it's much more than that. And we're not hearing from anyone across government, it seems, on the Labour side. Will you learn lessons from this? Will you take a breather and go, let's deal with the riots, but at some point you've got to ask, why are so many people from local areas rioting against their own police about, it appears, immigration issues? And that's a real concern. Well,
of course, it didn't help by labelling everybody far-right, because it's the same with the pro-Palestinian protests. You can't label them all as far-left. No. But it's quite
easy to label a whole group as being from one political persuasion. It doesn't mean you don't really have to go much further into why it's happening. And the why question is not being talked about really by government.
Well, will you get to speak to him? Will he take a question, hopefully, from GBNews?
I'm hoping to talk to the Minister later. And I'm hoping to have a Minister on 8 till 9 on GBNews tonight. And if that happens, do tune in. I know you'll be tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. Christopher Hope, thank you very much. That is, of course, GBNews' political editor, Christopher Hope.